Awesome. So welcome everyone. This is your literature reviews workshop. This is the first in our graduate student workshop series for LSU libraries. So there will be more to come. I am Brittany O'Neill. I am the Humanities and Social Sciences librarian at LSU Libraries. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different stages of the literature review process and how that all goes from beginning to end. So to start with, what is a literature review? So many of you have probably done an annotated bibliography in the past. It's similar, but not quite the same. Unlike an annotated bibliography, you are placing all of the scholarship in context. So it's looking at how the scholarly conversation unfolds. It can be a summary, but it's usually combined with some form of synthesis. So you're kind of breaking out the big points and the insights and how it converses with other works. It's often part of a research paper, but as some of you pointed out, it can be completely freestanding. It can just be on its own. It describes what's already known in literature, but also what gaps exist in the knowledge, and that's where you fit in. It informs the reader of existing scholarship, and it emphasizes your credibility by having done that research. So, lit reviews vary significantly by discipline. I am a humanities and social sciences person, but this is for everybody. So just a little bit of a sampling. In social sciences, this includes some data and statistics. It usually has some kind of organizational pattern. In the humanities, you're focusing more on primary sources than on secondary sources. And older articles are generally more okay because the knowledge in the humanities doesn't change as fast as it does in other disciplines. And in the sciences, it includes lots of data and statistics. It's less interdisciplinary, so searching is more focused. So what does this mean? You're going to have to look in multiple places, try multiple different search strategies, get organized, find some kind of way to manage the workload, but it's going to be okay. I'm going to help you with it. It's fine. I'm going to help you figure out the strategies for how to manage all of that. I know it seems like a lot. So these are our stops on our route for literature reviews. I'm going to go over how to choose a researchable topic, how to develop effective search strategies, how to evaluate your sources efficiently, how to stay organized, how to structure your lit review, and then we will arrive at our destination. So the important thing is you can get clarification if you need it. For those of you who are trying to write a literature review for a class or a dissertation or a thesis, you have faculty, you have advisors, you can go to them for help. That's what they're there for. It's the reason you have them. Some of the questions that you might ask might be how many? So if you're working on a dissertation or a thesis, those tend to be more exhaustive. You want to include more content, as opposed to just a standalone literature review or one that's part of an article. What kinds of sources? So most of people will think of things like peer-reviewed articles and edited scholarly books, but depending on your discipline, you may also include things like unpublished literature, gray literature, or scholarly blogs. It really kind of depends. How might you approach it? So are you being asked to mostly summarize, to do some synthesis, maybe to critique? Should you evaluate? For most people, the answer is yes, unless you're working on a systematic review, which I'll get into later. Smaller sections, maybe looking at a particular theme. Maybe we look at who your audience is. So if your audience has a more background knowledge, maybe you don't need to include as much information. And then what to include, what to exclude. These are all questions that you can ask. Totally okay to ask. You can ask your faculty, your advisors, your librarians. It's totally okay to ask these questions. So the first step in the research process is choosing a good research question. It's super important. The more narrow your topic is, the easier it will be to limit the sources that you're looking at. I know that you probably think you have the most narrow topic in the world, but I promise you're almost not likely going to get there. You can get more narrow. One way is to do some background research. So you can look at model articles that you can base your article off of to get an idea of the structure and some other kinds of sources you might include. These can be things like annual reviews, looking at the top scholarly journals, looking at other dissertations and theses, the seminal works, and even things like calls for papers where they're looking for new research that can give you an idea of something that you might write on. And ask your professors for suggestions. They know all of the stuff in the fields. They can give you suggestions for what you might look at. So then we're going to refine our topic. So unlike some people might think, you're not married to your topic. It is not until death do you part. Your topic is going to change every time you read new information. And that's the point. That is the point of the research process. So every time you read something, your topic is going to change a little bit, and it's okay. So you might refine by limiting to a particular time period. If you found too many sources, you might limit it to specific groups that you're looking at. You might add extra search terms or take some away, depending on whether or not you want to expand or narrow your topic. So I mentioned finding model articles. It's not as hard as you might think to find them. So to find other literature reviews, one way that you can do that is to search in a database. I have Academic Search Complete here as an example of a really broad database for really broad generic searches. And you could search for literature review or review and whatever your topic or field is. And that's going to pull up other review articles that you can use as a basis for seeing what kind of research is out there or how it's organized. You can also find annual reviews. Two ways you can do that. Annual reviews are basically, they come out annually for the most part, and they look at the past year of research in a particular area. So they can be really useful for getting that kind of overview. You can either look on the e-journals tab, which is on the library's homepage, and search for annual review of, and it's going to give you all the annual reviews. The other one is to look for annual reviews in our database list. That's just a database full of annual reviews on different topics. So that can be really useful. So the hard part is a lot of people have an idea of what they want to find. They just don't know how to search. So let's go over how to create those effective search strategies. We're going to get a little bit more in depth. This is kind of where we get into the, some people may know some of this already and some people may not. So know your vocabulary. It's good to know the jargon and the terminology that you use in your field, because databases need very specific wording to get the results that you want. Knowing how to use subject and keyword searches, how to use Boolean, how to use truncation. If that's all gibberish to you, I'm going to go over that, don't worry. How to limit and sort your results. Figuring out the best subjects and keywords. A lot of that is just from practice and looking at articles you find and seeing what subjects are affiliated with that article. Finding the prominent authors and journals, looking for trends, not just picking the newest articles and picking tangentially related articles on the same kind of topic. Just because it mentions something offhand or it's brand new doesn't mean that you have to include it. Sometimes there's a stronger argument in a different article, and that's okay. And write down the searches that you've tried and where you've tried them. I'm going to give you a little bit more information about that so you can get an idea of how to keep track of stuff. So, a little bit more into the search techniques. So by default, most databases search by keyword. So it's searching the full text of the sources, whether it's mentioned offhand somewhere in the lit review or in the abstract. It's just searching for any mention anywhere in the text. If I search by subject, that's searching for the aboutness of the whole article. So that's looking at what the core focus of the article is and not just if it's mentioned anywhere. If you have no idea what subjects to use, ask your librarian. We're experts at this. We can help you figure it out. You can also use Boolean. So Boolean is a strategy where you can kind of combine words to either get more results or fewer. So for example, maybe I'm researching something about alcohol use in teenagers. Then I could maybe search for alcohol and teenagers. That's only going to give me results that use both of those phrases. So I'm going to get fewer, more specific results. If I switch that out for or, alcohol or teenagers, that's going to give me anything that mentions either of those, not necessarily both. So that's going to give me more results, but less focused. And then I can use not to throw things out that are irrelevant. I use the example of, let's say I'm a computer scientist and I'm researching something about Windows operating systems. So I search for Windows and I keep getting things about curtains, things about architecture. I can use the not filter to throw those things out. I also mentioned truncation. You might also hear this called wildcard searching. So basically that takes a root word and I add an asterisk at the end, and that gives me more results that fit that root word. Like I said, databases require those very specific words to get the stuff that you want. So let's say I'm looking for something on interaction. I could do interact asterisk and I get anything that comes after that: interacting, interaction, interactivity. I could search for child and get childhood, childcare, anything like that. It's a good way to capture a little bit more in your search. So now you've got your search strategies. Where do you look? Choosing databases is super important because you could have the best search strategy in the world, but if you're looking in the wrong place, you're not going to get the results that you want. So a few places that you can look. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. There's no one-stop shop that gives you everything you want. There's a reason we have a database list, and it's because you can't just look in one. So one thing you can do is go through our database list. It's on the library's homepage, and you can sort it by a couple of different filters. So you can sort by subject. Let's say I want to do stuff in history. It'll give me only the 40 or so history databases that we have. Or I'm doing research in newspapers. There's a filter to look at only newspaper databases. You can also use the catalog. So the library's catalog searches anything that we consider print. I use quotes because it's not necessarily always printed. It's things like books, but also ebooks, journals, newspapers, microfilm, government documents, anything that you would think of as traditional library stuff you'll find in the catalog, as well as things that are in special collections. WorldCat is basically a catalog for the world. So it searches not just what we have, because we don't own everything, but also searches what other libraries have. Highly recommend you use WorldCat. It's linked on the library's homepage, because WorldCat will help you find stuff that you can get through interlibrary loan. Web of Science is also a good source for those of you in the sciences, less so for the humanities and social sciences. Their content is not as great there, but it's really helpful for the sciences. I mentioned how to find the important authors' works, publications. The easiest way, I think, is to do a search. If you find a good article, mine it for all it's worth. It's not cheating, it's being resourceful. So there are two ways that you can mine it. They're called forward chaining and backward chaining. Essentially, forward chaining is looking at everybody who has cited that article since, so more recent stuff on that topic. There are two ways that you can do that: Google Scholar and the Web of Science cited reference search. So I have an example here for what it looks like in Google Scholar. I searched for the title of this book. And then if you look at the cited by count, if I click on that link, that's going to give me all of the sources that Google Scholar has indexed that have cited that work. So it's a good way to find more recent articles that you may not have catch. Backward chaining is essentially looking at who that article cites. So you're working backwards. That's as easy as just looking at the references and going back and looking at those sources. So it's a good way to find stuff that maybe you didn't capture in your search. I've also linked on here Ulrich's Web and journal citation reports. Those are really good for finding what the top journals are in your field. They have things like journal impact factor, how important it is by their different metrics. Those can be really useful, especially if you're thinking about publishing, to find a good journal to publish in. I will note that Ulrich's is only available on campus or if you remote in. So if you have difficulty with that, just let me know and I can help you find it. And also just ask your professors. Your professors know the fields. They know who the top authors are. They know who what the top journals are. So feel free to ask them. That's what they're there for. I mentioned tracking your searches. So I have here a template for a search log. I will send this to you after the presentation, but it's essentially a way to keep track of your searches, good or bad. You want to do both. So let's say I did a search in Discovery. My keywords worked really well. I got exactly the results that I wanted. Write that down so you know that those keywords worked well. That way you can do that exact same search in a different database and you know that it will get you some good results. On the other hand, if you do a search and you get garbage results, you want to write that down so you don't search in that same way again, because we know it doesn't work. Another way that you can keep track is to set up alerts. There are a couple of things like Site You Like and RSS feeds that allow you to get alerts when something new pops up within certain criteria. Most of our databases have saved search alerts built in. I can show you that later if you'd like. But essentially, usually in the top right-hand side, there's a drop-down menu where you can save your searches. So let's say I had that really good search results page. I really liked those keywords. I don't want to have to keep searching over and over again. So if I set up that saved search alert, that will send me an email every time something new gets published that fits that criteria, so I don't have to keep searching. If you want publication alerts, most journals on their own homepage have a place where you can subscribe and get notifications when a new issue comes out. So I would recommend that too. But at some point, you have to stop. You have to quit at some point. There is no way that you can find every article or book ever written. A good lit review is a done lit review. So eventually you have to call it quits. You have to write it at some point, and that's okay. So you've found as much as you can. Now, how do I read all of those hundreds of articles that I popped up? I am a big proponent of not reading from beginning to end. I think it's a waste of time on the first read, because if I get 200 results, maybe not all of them are going to be relevant, but I'm going to read from beginning to end. And then by the time I get to the end, I've wasted 15, 30 minutes on an article that wasn't any good. So what I recommend is reading the abstract first. So the abstract is basically just a summary. If I read the abstract and it's relevant, solid, keep reading. If it's not, the rest of the article isn't going to be either. Move on, read a different article. Then I usually read the intro and the conclusion to give me some context. Then I'll read the methods. So the methods are going to tell me how they conducted their study. This can be important because let's say I'm a communication disorders scholar and I'm studying some particular intervention having to do with children. If I do a search and I get an article and I go to the method section and I see that their population is adults, I probably want to throw it out. They're not looking at the same population that I am. And then I look at the results. That's going to tell me what the findings are. Then I mine through the references. And then at that point, I'll go back to the beginning and start taking notes if it was worth it. But I don't like to read articles from beginning to end. It's not the most efficient way to read it on the first chance. So then I have to evaluate the sources. So ask yourself some of these questions. Is it scholarly? In some disciplines, that doesn't matter, but in some cases, let's say you're working on a lit review for a class and they've said only peer-reviewed scholarly articles, then you can throw away anything that isn't. Is it a primary, secondary, or tertiary source? So quick review, primary sources are things like historical documents and original research. Secondary sources tend to be more commentary. Tertiary sources are things like encyclopedias and dictionaries, things that kind of give an overview of a topic. Basically, never do you need a tertiary source for your lit review, but it really depends who your audience is, whether or not they need the background information. Publication date. So if you have a discipline where you need more up-to-date information, you may be able to throw out the older content. Really depends on your discipline. Is it relevant and is it valuable? So does that article provide any new insight? Scholarship is not all created equal. Sometimes there are articles that are really just fluff pieces. They don't state anything new. So as you're reading, see if it really actually says anything important or valuable, or if you can just toss it. And who is the author? This kind of goes twofold. So you may find something from a preeminent scholar that really just keeps popping up in your research. You probably want to include them. On the other hand, you may have sort of a quota that you're trying to meet. Let's say you're seeking out authors of color. You may want to seek out particular voices. So that's something you might evaluate on. And then of course, objectivity. Is there bias in whatever you're looking at? But you're not only evaluating each of the individual articles, you're evaluating as a whole. So I mentioned that all of scholarship is a conversation. So you want to look at what connects these articles, what solutions do they suggest, what aspects are missing. This is where you will come in. How is the material presented? What trends and debates are present? If you find that somebody is maybe outside the conversation, that may be worth including, but it may also be worth excluding if it just doesn't fit in anywhere. Just a few ways that you can evaluate. And then figuring out how to organize all of this information. So some people are like me and they like the big stack of things. I'll show you my latest article, big stack of lit review. Some people like that, but I usually recommend not to do the big stack of things because it's not a great way of organizing. So one way that you can deal with this is to use citation management software. So I have a few examples here, Zotero, EndNote, and Mendeley. They're all a little bit different, but essentially it's a place where you can save and keep track of all of your sources. Most of them have some kind of browser add-on where you can click and save the articles. It's really great because it saves all of the PDFs as well as the citation information. You can export it into Word. It saves so much time. There are some workshops upcoming if you would like to get some practice using these for Zotero and Mendeley. So you can find those in the same place where you booked this workshop. But I highly recommend using citation managers. I use that in addition to the big pile. And then how do you structure that? So you found all of the articles, how do you start to kind of place them? Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, literature reviews tend to look like any other essay you've probably written before. So they usually have an intro, a body, and a conclusion. Not always, but usually. So your introduction is going to be the main organizing principle. Why did you organize it this way? Why is it being presented the way it's being presented? And then the body, which is the discussion and the synthesis of all of those sources, and then the conclusion. So you're going to talk about what is the state of the literature. Now that you've reviewed it, where are we at? What is missing? And how can the conversation move forward? Something to keep in mind, though, is that this is not where you introduce your argument. You're merely setting the foundation where your argument can come in. There are so many different ways that you could structure a literature review, but I'll just go through a few. So you could look chronologically, especially if you're looking at the history of a topic. You could go by a particular trend. You could organize by particular publications. You could look at different themes. You might look at different methodologies. So you might have different subsections depending on how the survey or study was conducted. You might create arguments and put those in sections. You might look at particular theories of how your work has been analyzed. You might look at systematic reviews. That's something we'll get into in a second. It may include the current situation or the history, and it may also include kind of an analysis of methods and standards. So I mentioned those systematic reviews. Big warning, systematic reviews are so different from regular literature reviews. If you are working on a systematic review, you can basically ignore everything I just told you. Systematic reviews are very different. The focus is more on the journey than the destination. It's more about the process of research and less on the actual research itself. It takes so much time, and that is why they usually have multiple authors. Most of you are probably not working on a systematic review, but just so you know what they are, so you know what to look for, it's basically a literature review that exists in a box. So let's say I'm looking for every article that fits these particular search criteria in these date ranges, only in these journals, and I'm grabbing everything that fits in that box, no evaluation, just everything that fits that criteria. It can include all kinds of things, but it's a whole different ballpark than doing a regular literature review. If you are doing one, I highly recommend that you check out our systematic reviews guide. Super helpful. We have great science librarians who work on this. Systematic reviews are really common in the sciences, but really uncommon in any other discipline. They're getting a little bit more common, but they're still really rare. There is a systematic reviews workshop coming up, same place where you booked this one. So if you are someone who has that upcoming or thinks they might, I would highly recommend that you check that out. So now we get to the writing it part. We've found all of the sources, we've organized everything, we kind of figured out the conversation, how it's going to take place. Now you have to write it. I'm only going to go into this a little bit because writing is not really the focus of this workshop. It's more about the research process, but just a little bit of information. So you should use the sources to support your argument, but keep your argument to yourself during the literature review. The point is to present whatever gaps and limitations exist in the literature, so that way your argument is obvious that it comes next, but it does not come in the literature review. You should see how the scholarship kind of converses, look at how it all fits together. It's also good to be critical. That is the point of a literature review, is to be critical. You don't have to take everything scholars say at face value. So you can be critical of their research design. You can be critical of the conclusions they've made. You can be critical of the limitations of their studies. That is the point, is to identify whatever gaps exist in knowledge where you can fit in. Avoid relying on secondary sources. So a lot of times students will find a citation in an article and they just want to cite where they found it. Don't do that. Go back to the original source, because you don't want to trust the secondary source's interpretation of that original research. It's better to go back to the original source. If you're going to be critical, make it based in evidence. So don't just be critical just to be critical. Be selective. Use quotes sparingly. So a lot of these points people struggle with because they may get in the habit of using a lot of direct quotes, and you don't really want to do that very often unless there's no better way to phrase it. So what I find tends to be helpful is when I find an article, as I'm reading, I take notes of what the big ideas are, what's interesting about it, rather than grabbing exact quotes. I'll give you an example. This is one I have the big ideas on the top of the article, and I've highlighted some things. So that way I don't have to worry about grabbing a quote and then trying to paraphrase it. I'm focusing on the big ideas. You still want to cite it though. And then revise, revise, revise. You will not sit down and write your whole literature review in one fell swoop and never have to touch it again. It's just not how it works. That is the point though. The point is that it's an iterative process. You're going to just keep rewriting it, and that's okay. I'm on my third version of the literature review I'm working on now. So that's the point. It's okay. Give yourself the time to do that though. And then you've arrived at your destination. It's a lot of steps. I know this is a ton of information, so I'm trying to leave time for all of your more specific questions. But if you have any questions about the literature review process, figuring out what databases to use, effective search strategies, how to use those citation managers, anything having to do with the research process, please get to know your subject librarians. If you don't already know them, you can find their contact information on the library's homepage, but of course you can always ask me for help too. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and stop our recording.